Do you know what the most terrifying sound a radio operator can hear in the middle of war is? It's not silence. It's not the screams of the enemy. It's hearing the voice of a man you helped bury 3 days earlier, whispering your name through static. My name is Sergeant Jack, and today I'm going to tell you about Corporal Elias and a radio frequency that should never have existed. A frequency that turned military technology into a bridge to something that dwells in the shadows of the Belgian forests for centuries. By the end of this story, you'll never hear radio static the same way again. Have you ever heard the sound of silence? I'm not talking about that peaceful quiet of a Sunday morning, when the world is still sleeping and even the birds respect the tranquility. I'm talking about the silence that comes after the last shot echoes through the forest, when even the crows stop cawing, when the wind itself seems to hold its breath, as if nature knew something terrible was about to happen. It's a silence that has weight, that presses on your eardrums as if you were descending to the bottom of the ocean. It was exactly that kind of silence that I heard on that December night in 1944 in the frozen forests of the Ardennes. And I can guarantee one thing. After what happened to me in those frozen trenches, you'll never look at a radio the same way again. You'll never hear static without wondering if there's something whispering from the other side. Because I learned, in the worst possible way, that our technology can be a bridge to places where the dead don't rest in peace. My name is Jack Elias, and I was a sergeant in the 101st Airborne Division. Today, at 98 years old, with trembling hands and a hoarse voice, this is the first time I'm telling this complete story. For almost 80 years, I've carried this secret like a stone in my chest, because I knew no one would believe it. Military doctors would diagnose me with post-traumatic stress. Psychiatrists would say it was combat fatigue. Family members would whisper that the war had broken my mind. But now, with one foot in the grave and the other slipping, I've decided you need to know the truth about what really happened during the Battle of the Bulge. Because what I experienced in those trenches wasn't just war. It wasn't just the common horror of men killing men. It was something much, much worse. It was an encounter with forces that existed long before the first humans set foot on this earth. Forces that learned to use our own technology against us. It was December 19th, 1944. The winter in the Ardennes was killing more soldiers than German bullets. The cold was so intense that weapon metal cracked with dry snaps that echoed through the forest like phantom shots. Breath froze before it even left the mouth, forming ice crystals that stuck to mustaches and beards. Soldiers were found dead in their positions, frozen so quickly they still held their weapons, like war statues carved in ice. I was operating an SCR-300 radio in an advanced position, about 2 kilometers north of Bastogne, when it all began. The position was strategic, a small elevation that offered clear vision of the surrounding valleys and, theoretically, good radio reception. My trench was little more than a hole in the ground covered with branches and canvas for camouflage, but it had been my world for 3 days. Before the war, I was just Jack Elias from Cedar Rapids, Iowa. I worked in my father's radio shop, fixing devices for farmers and small merchants. My life was simple and predictable. I woke up at 6 in the morning, had coffee with my mother, walked 3 blocks to the shop, and spent the day with my hands dirty with oil and solder, bringing broken radios back to life. The most dangerous thing I faced was an occasional electric shock or climbing on the roof to adjust antennas during storms. My specialty was finding clear frequencies when other technicians gave up. I had a natural ear for distinguishing genuine signals from interference. I could identify if a noise came from a car engine, a distant storm, or a poorly calibrated radio just by listening to the quality of the static. It was a gift my father said I inherited from my grandfather, who had been a telegraph operator in World War I. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, I was 19 years old with a quiet future ahead of me. I was going to marry Sarah Mackenzie the following spring, take over the shop when my father retired, have children, grow old in peace. But like millions of other young Americans, I traded my simple dreams for a uniform and a rifle. The Army quickly discovered my ability with radio equipment. I was trained to operate the SCR-300, a portable radio that weighed almost 20 kilograms and had a range of up to 5 kilometers under ideal conditions. My function was to maintain contact with command and coordinate patrol movements. It was vital work, but one that frequently left me alone in isolated positions, depending only on my voice crackling through static to maintain contact with the civilized world. I had spent 3 years operating communication equipment, from the scorching sands of North Africa to the bloody beaches of Normandy. I knew every radio model used by the American Army, every authorized frequency, every communication protocol. I could distinguish the noise of a Panzer engine from atmospheric static at kilometers away. I could identify if a transmission came from a captured German radio just by the signal quality. But on that cold December night, in the haunted forests of the Ardennes, all my experience and technical knowledge didn't prepare me for what was about to happen. Operation Wacht am Rhein had begun 5 days earlier. The Germans launched their last great offensive on the Western Front, catching Allied forces completely unprepared. What should have been a quiet sector in the Ardennes, where inexperienced troops were sent to gain experience and tired veterans rested, became hell on earth. Panzer divisions emerged from the morning mist like steel ghosts, shattering poorly prepared American lines. My squad had been sent on a reconnaissance mission 3 days earlier. We were 12 men, led by Lieutenant Marcus Webb, a young but competent officer from Ohio. Marcus was only 23 years old, but had already proven his worth in Normandy and the campaign through France. He was the type of officer soldiers would follow to hell because they knew he would bring them back. Besides me, the squad included some of the best soldiers I ever knew. Corporal Danny Morrison was our demolition specialist, a tall, thin Texan who could make a bridge explode with surgical precision. He had an easy smile and a ready joke for any situation, no matter how desperate. Danny was the kind of man who kept morale high when everything seemed lost. Private Tommy Chen was our sniper, a Japanese-American from Hawaii who had enlisted right after Pearl Harbor, despite the prejudices he faced. Tommy could hit a coin at 300 meters and move through the forest like a ghost. He was quiet and thoughtful, but when he spoke, everyone listened, because his words always carried weight. Lieutenant Marcus Webb was more than our commander. He was our older brother, our moral compass in a world that had lost all direction. He came from a military family. His father had served in World War I, his grandfather in the Civil War. Marcus carried this tradition with pride, but without arrogance. He knew that leadership didn't mean giving orders, but setting an example. We were a war family, united by spilled blood and shared fear. We had gone through Omaha Beach together, liberated French villages together, cried over dead comrades together. We knew each other's habits, quirks, secret fears. Danny always checked his grenades 3 times before a mission. Tommy carried a photo of his girlfriend in his shirt pocket, on the left side, over his heart. Marcus wrote a letter to his wife every night, even when there was no way to send it. And me? I always tuned the radio at exactly 6 p.m. for the nightly report, following a ritual I had developed to maintain sanity amid the chaos of war. The mission seemed routine when it started. We were supposed to conduct reconnaissance of German positions north of Bastogne, identify weak points in enemy lines, and return with information for command. It was the type of mission we had done dozens of times before. We entered the forest on the morning of December 16th, confident and well-equipped. The Ardennes forests in December were a fairy tale world transformed into a nightmare. Century-old trees rose like Gothic cathedrals, their intertwined branches blocking most of the sunlight. The ground was covered by a thick layer of dead leaves and snow, which muffled our steps, but also hid treacherous roots and dangerous holes. With each step, dry branches cracked like breaking bones, echoing through the silent forest. The cold was a constant enemy. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was deadly. It penetrated through all layers of clothing, found every small opening in the uniform, settled in the bones like a disease. Our breaths created vapor clouds that could give us away to the enemy, so we learned to breathe through handkerchiefs to disperse the vapor. Our fingers became so numb we could barely pull weapon triggers. For 2 days the mission went according to plan. We identified several German positions, mapped supply routes, collected valuable information about troop movements. Marcus was satisfied with our progress and planned to return to American lines the next morning. But on the morning of December 19th, everything changed. We were crossing a small valley when Danny, who was at the point of the formation, raised his closed fist, the signal to stop immediately. We all froze, weapons ready, ears alert. For long seconds we heard nothing but the wind whispering among the branches. Then Danny pointed forward and made the enemy in sight signal. Through the morning mist, we could see movement among the trees. German soldiers, at least a dozen, moving in our direction. It wasn't a casual patrol, it was a search force specifically looking for something or someone. Marcus made the decision quickly. He signaled for us to spread out and seek cover. The plan was to let the Germans pass and then continue our withdrawal. But the Germans had other plans. They knew we were there. The ambush began with a single rifle shot, which hit Tommy right in the chest. He fell without a sound, his eyes widening in surprise before closing forever. Then hell broke loose. Machine gun fire cut through the air, shattering branches and raising clouds of snow. Grenades exploded among the trees, sending deadly fragments in all directions. Danny tried to flank the German position, using his demolition skills to create a distraction. He managed to eliminate 3 enemy soldiers before stepping on an anti-personnel mine. The explosion threw him against a tree with enough force to break his spine. He died instantly, but his eyes remained open, staring fixedly at the grey sky. Marcus tried to coordinate our defense, shouting orders through the deafening noise of battle. He managed to eliminate 2 German snipers with his .45 pistol before a grenade exploded a few meters from him. The shrapnel hit him in the chest and abdomen, opening wounds that bled profusely in the white snow. I managed to drag Marcus behind a fallen tree, but it was already too late. He was losing blood rapidly, his breathing becoming increasingly weak and irregular. With his last strength, he grabbed my shirt and whispered, "Jack, take the information back. Tell them about the German positions. Don't let us die in vain." I held his hand as he died, feeling life escape from his fingers like water. I closed his eyes and took his identification tags, silently promising I would fulfill his last order. Of the 12 men who entered the forest, only 4 came out alive. 3 other soldiers and I managed to escape the ambush and return to American lines, carrying with us the information Marcus had died to protect. But we also carried something more: survivor's guilt. The crushing weight of having lived when better men than us had died. I reported the ambush to command, delivered the collected information, and helped organize a recovery mission to retrieve the bodies of our comrades. We found Danny and Tommy where they had fallen, but Marcus had disappeared. There were blood trails leading deeper into the forest, but the trail was lost in the snow and dead leaves. We spent 2 days searching for Marcus, but never found him. Command finally declared him missing in action, presumed dead. His wife in Ohio would receive a standard letter and a folded flag. His children would grow up without knowing exactly how or where their father had died. 3 days after the ambush, I was assigned to an advanced observation position, operating a radio post alone 2 kilometers from the main lines. It was a disguised punishment. Command thought I needed time to recover from the trauma of the ambush. They didn't know they were sending me to something much worse than any battle against German soldiers. The first night alone was surprisingly normal. I established contact with Command at exactly 6 p.m., reported nothing to declare according to protocol, and prepared for a long vigil. My trench was well camouflaged, dug behind a century-old oak tree that had been struck by lightning at some point in the past. The dead tree offered excellent cover, and its height facilitated radio reception. The cold was so intense, I had to stamp my feet every few minutes to maintain circulation. My breath formed vapor clouds that froze instantly on my mustaches and helmet fabric. I had brought enough rations for 3 days and water in canteens that I kept close to my body to prevent them from freezing. The SCR 300 radio was working perfectly. I did routine checks every hour, tuning different frequencies to monitor enemy activity and maintain contact with other units in the region. Everything was normal. Everything was under control. Around 10 p.m., I began my nightly frequency sweep. It was a standard procedure. Systematically tune each authorized frequency, listen for a few minutes, note any activity, and move to the next. It was tedious work, but vital for maintaining battlefield situational awareness. It was during this sweep that I noticed something strange. Between 2 known military frequencies, there was a band that should have been empty, but was emitting a weak signal. It wasn't normal static. There was a pattern in the noise, as if it were a very distant or very weak transmission to be clearly understood. I carefully adjusted the radio controls, trying to isolate and amplify the signal. It was a skill I had developed over years working with radio equipment, the ability to extract weak signals from background noise. Slowly, the signal became clearer, and then I heard something that made my blood freeze. It was a whisper, low, almost inaudible, but distinctly human, and it was speaking in English with an American accent. At first I thought it was some wounded soldier trying to ask for help through a damaged radio, maybe someone lost in the forest, desperately trying to establish contact. I increased the volume and adjusted the tuning more precisely. The whisper became clearer, and that's when I felt my stomach turn with horror. I knew that voice. It was Danny Morrison. There was no doubt. It was his characteristic voice, with that unmistakable Texan accent, that particular way of pronouncing certain words. But Danny was dead. I had seen his body torn apart by the mine explosion. I had helped carry his remains back to American lines. I had seen when they covered him with a tarp and placed him with the other dead. But there was his voice, whispering through the static. "Jack, Jack, are you hearing me? I'm trying to get home, Jack, but it's so dark here, so cold. I can't find the way." My first reaction was pure shock. I dropped the headphone as if it were a poisonous snake and stared at the radio as if it were a cursed object. My heart was beating so hard I could hear it echoing inside the steel helmet. My hands were shaking, and it wasn't just because of the cold. I took a deep breath, trying to compose myself. Maybe it was combat fatigue. Maybe it was the cold affecting my mind. Maybe it was just coincidence. Some other soldier with a similar voice, wounded somewhere in the forest, delirious and mentioning random names. I put the headphone back on and adjusted the frequency again. For a few minutes, I heard only normal static. I began to convince myself that I had imagined everything, that the stress and trauma of the ambush were making me hallucinate. But then I heard the second voice. "Jack, why did you leave us behind?" It was Tommy Chen, unmistakably. His calm, measured voice, with that slight Hawaiian accent that became more pronounced when he was emotional. "We trusted you, Jack. You were our radio operator. It was your responsibility to keep us in contact with command. Why didn't you call for help?" My rational mind tried to find explanations. Maybe it was German propaganda, using recordings of dead American soldiers' voices to demoralize troops. The Germans were known for sophisticated psychological tactics. But how would they have gotten recordings of Danny and Tommy's voices? And how would they know my name? And then came the third voice, the one that made me completely question my sanity. "Sergeant Elias, you need to help us find our way back." It was Lieutenant Marcus Webb speaking with that natural authority that made soldiers automatically straighten up. "We're lost, Sergeant. We can't find the American lines. Can you guide us through the radio?" Marcus, the man I had watched die, whose eyes I had closed with my own hands, whose last order I had promised to fulfill, but there was his voice, clear as if he were standing beside me. 3 voices, 3 dead men, all speaking to me through a frequency that shouldn't exist, as if they were on the other side of a very thin wall trying to cross over to the world of the living. I tried to respond, but my voice came out as a hoarse grunt. "Who's there? Identify yourself. What's your position?" Silence returned, just static. For long minutes I heard nothing but the white noise of the radio and the wind whispering among the branches of the dead tree above me. I began to think I had imagined everything, that stress and cold were making me hallucinate. But then, after almost an hour of silence, the voices returned, and this time they were different, clearer, closer, and they knew things they shouldn't know. "Jack," whispered Danny, "we know where you are. North Trench, Sector 7, behind the oak tree with the lightning mark. You're cold, aren't you? You're thinking about Sarah, your girlfriend from Cedar Rapids. You're wondering if she's still waiting for you, if she received your letters, if she found another man while you're here fighting." My blood froze. There was no way he could know this. The trench where I was positioned was an improvised position I had dug myself a few hours earlier, following camouflage protocols that weren't in any German manual. And Sarah? I hadn't talked about Sarah with anyone in the squad. It was my secret, my emotional anchor to endure the hell of war. Sarah Mackenzie, hair blonde like ripe wheat, eyes blue like the Iowa sky in summer. We had met in high school, dated for 3 years before I enlisted. She had promised to wait for me, but that was 3 years ago. 3 years of censored letters and faded photographs. 3 years of wondering if she still loved me, if she still thought about me, if she hadn't found someone better, someone who was there to comfort her when she cried, to dance with her at town dances, to build a future that didn't depend on surviving a war. "Tommy," continued Danny's voice, "tell Jack about what you're seeing." Tommy Chen's voice echoed through the static, but now there was something different about it, a quality I couldn't identify, as if he were speaking through water. "They're coming up the hill, Jack, but they're not Germans. They're different. They walk wrong. They make sounds they shouldn't make, and they know you're there." "How many?" I asked, nervously checking the surroundings with my binoculars. It's not a question of how many, replied Marcus, his officer's voice taking on that tone he used when he was about to give important orders. It's a question of what? Jack, you need to understand. There are things in these forests that existed long before this war, long before the Germans, long before the Americans. Things that learned to use our technology against us. How much time? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. 347 seconds, Tommy replied with military precision. 346, 345. They were doing a countdown to my death. I grabbed my M1 Garand rifle and scanned the darkness around the trench. The snow had stopped falling, and the full moon created ghostly shadows among the trees. I couldn't see anything moving, but there was something in the air, a strange smell I couldn't identify. It was like rusty iron mixed with wet earth and something more, something organic and rotten, like meat left in the sun for days. 300 seconds, continued Tommy's voice, relentless as a metronome. I tried to use the radio to call command, turning the dial to emergency frequencies, but all other frequencies were dead, just static. It was as if that damned frequency, 42.5 MHz, was the only thing working on the radio, the only bridge between my world and whatever was on the other side. Jack, whispered Marcus, you need to understand. We're not really dead, not the way you think. We're trapped between the world of the living and the place we go when we die. And now they're using our voices to find other soldiers. You're not the first, Jack, you won't be the last. What do you want from me? I shouted into the radio, no longer caring if anyone could hear me. We want you to come with us, replied Danny, but his voice was changing, becoming more distorted. It's so lonely here, Jack, so cold, so dark. And they promised that if we bring more soldiers, more lost souls, they'll let us rest. Let us go where we should have gone when we died. 250 seconds, announced Tommy. That's when I heard it, a sound that was neither human nor animal. It was as if someone were dragging dry branches through the snow, but in a rhythm that suggested footsteps. Footsteps of something very large, or many small things moving in perfect synchronization. The sound came from several directions at once, as if I were being surrounded. I pointed my rifle in the direction of the nearest sound and engaged the safety. The metallic click echoed in the silent night, like a shot. My breathing was creating vapor clouds that could give me away, so I tried to breathe slower, more quietly, through the handkerchief I kept over my face. 200 seconds, whispered Tommy. They can sense your fear, Jack. The more fear you feel, the easier it becomes for them to find you. Fear is like a beacon in the darkness for these creatures. Who are they? I asked in a low voice, trying to keep panic out of my voice. We don't know for certain, replied Marcus, his officer's voice trying to maintain calm even in the impossible situation. They were here before the war, before the Germans, before the Americans, maybe before humans. They live in the deepest parts of the forest, where light never reaches, where time moves differently, and they feed on us, on our vital essence, on our souls, on everything that makes us human. The sound was getting closer. Now I could distinguish that they weren't normal footsteps. It was as if something were dragging itself, stopping to sniff the air, and then dragging itself again. And there was a breathing sound, heavy and irregular, as if it were filtered through water or something worse. 150 seconds, announced Tommy. Jack, said Danny, but his voice was becoming increasingly distorted, less human. You still have time to run, but if you run, they'll hunt you. And when they catch you, it will be much worse than if you simply surrender, accept the inevitable. Surrender to what? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady while checking my ammunition. To join us, replied Marcus, to become one of the voices on the radio, to help find other lost soldiers, other lonely men who need company. It's not so bad, Jack. After a while, you don't even feel pain anymore. Don't feel cold anymore. Don't feel fear anymore. 100 seconds. That's when I saw it, a shadow moving among the trees, but it wasn't a normal shadow. It was as if darkness itself had gained form and substance, as if someone had cut a piece of the night and given it life. It was approximately the height of a man, but moved in a way that defied all human anatomy. It seemed to flow like liquid, but maintained a vaguely solid form. And it wasn't alone. There were two other identical forms moving in parallel, surrounding my position with the precision of experienced predators. They moved without making noise, gliding over the snow as if they had no weight, but leaving footprints I could see clearly in the moonlight. 50 seconds, whispered Tommy. Jack, they're almost there. You can see them now, can't you? You can feel the cold they bring with them? I could, and what I saw made me question everything I thought I knew about reality. The forms weren't completely solid. I could see through them as if they were made of dense smoke or dark mist, but they left footprints in the snow. Footprints that didn't have human shape. They were too long, with marks that suggested claws instead of fingers. 40 seconds. Jack, said Danny, but now his voice was completely distorted, sounding as if it came from very far away or very deep. You were a good sergeant, a good friend. We don't want you to suffer unnecessarily. Just let it happen. Accept it. It will be easier for all of us. 30 seconds. The three forms were now at the edge of my trench. Up close I could see they had something that vaguely resembled faces, but they were wrong faces, as if someone had tried to sculpt human features in darkness and had failed miserably. Where there should have been eyes, there were only holes darker than darkness itself. Where there should have been a mouth, there was an opening that seemed to extend much deeper than should be possible. 20 seconds. I squeezed the trigger of my rifle and fired in the direction of the nearest form. The blast echoed through the forest like thunder, and the flash of the shot momentarily illuminated the scene around me. The bullet passed straight through the creature, as if I were shooting at mist. The creature didn't even slow down. 15 seconds. I fired again and again. 8 shots from my M1 Garand, all passing through the creatures without causing any effect. The empty clip jumped from the rifle with a characteristic metallic ping, and I began to reload with trembling hands. 10 seconds. 9. 8. One of the creatures extended something that could be an arm in my direction. It was longer than a human arm should be, and ended in something that definitely weren't fingers. Where it touched me, I felt a cold that went beyond the physical. It was as if I were being drained from the inside out, as if my own vital essence were being sucked through that touch. 7. 6. 5. I could feel my strength draining away. My vision was becoming blurry, and there was a growing buzzing in my ears that didn't come from the radio. It was as if I was sinking in dark water, losing contact with the physical world. 4, 3, 2. And then, at the last possible second, I heard something that changed everything. The sound of tank engines approaching through the forest. Searchlights cut through the darkness like swords of light, sweeping among the trees. Human voices shouting orders in English. An American reconnaissance patrol had found my position. 1. The creatures immediately retreated, dissolving into darkness as if they had never existed. The supernatural cold that had enveloped me disappeared, replaced by the normal cold of winter in the Ardennes. The radio emitted one last whisper, but now the voices sounded distant and weak. Until next time, Jack. Until next time. And then, silence. Just the noise of approaching engines and the voices of American soldiers. The patrol soldiers found me in a state of shock, clinging to the radio as if my life depended on it. I was shaking uncontrollably, not just because of the cold, but because of what I had experienced. My eyes were wide, fixed on a point in space where the creatures had disappeared. Sergeant Mike O'Connor, an Irish veteran from the 82nd Airborne, was the first to reach me. He had seen soldiers in shock before and recognized the signs immediately. "Hey, soldier," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "Are you okay? What happened here?" I tried to explain, but the words came out in disconnected fragments. The voices, on the radio, my dead friends. They were here. The creatures. I knew how it sounded. I knew it seemed like the delirium of a man who had spent too much time alone in the cold. O'Connor checked my radio, tuning various frequencies. Everything normal, just static and routine military communications. There was no sign of frequency 42.5 MHz, or the voices I had heard. It was as if they had never existed. "Soldier," said O'Connor, "how many days have you been alone in this position?" 3 days, I replied, trying to control the tremors. "Combat fatigue," murmured one of the other soldiers. "Happens to the best. The cold, the loneliness, the stress. The mind starts playing tricks." But O'Connor was more experienced. He noticed details the others missed. The strange footprints in the snow around my trench, the residual smell in the air like iron and decomposition, the way the forest animals were completely silent, as if something had frightened them deeply. "Let's get you out of here," he said finally. "You need hot food, a dry place to sleep, and maybe talk to the chaplain." I reported the incident to my superior officer, Captain James Morrison, no relation to Danny. Morrison was a practical man, an engineer from Minnesota who had enlisted right after Pearl Harbor. He listened to my report patiently, making occasional notes, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes. "Sergeant Elias," he said when I finished, "you went through significant trauma a few days ago. You lost 3 close companions in combat. You spent 3 days alone in extreme conditions. What you described are classic symptoms of severe combat stress." "But the voices, sir," I insisted. "They knew things they shouldn't know. Specific details about my position, about my personal life. The human mind is capable of extraordinary things when under stress," Morrison replied. "It can create memories, voices, even entire experiences that seem completely real. It's a defense mechanism, a way to process trauma." The report was filed as severe combat fatigue with hallucinatory episodes. I was sent to a field hospital for observation and subsequently transferred to non-combat duties. Officially, I had suffered a nervous breakdown. There was no mention of voices on the radio or shadow creatures, but the story doesn't end there. In fact, it was just beginning. 3 weeks later, while I was recovering in a field hospital in Luxembourg, I received an unexpected visit. Sergeant O'Connor appeared in my infirmary with a somber expression I hadn't seen before. "Elias," he said, sitting in the chair next to my bed, "I need to talk to you about something that happened at your old position." My stomach contracted. "What happened?" "Another radio operator was assigned to that position. Corporal Stevens, from the 28th Infantry Division. Good soldier, experienced Normandy veteran." O'Connor paused, running his hand through his graying hair. "He disappeared on the second night." "Disappeared how?" "We found the trench intact. Equipment organized, weapon clean and loaded, rations untouched. But Stevens had vanished without a trace. No sign of struggle, no footprints leading away from the position. It was as if he had simply evaporated." O'Connor leaned forward, lowering his voice. "But there's something more. His radio was still on when we found it, tuned to a frequency that wasn't in any military manual. And when we tested the frequency—" "What did you hear?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Voices," said O'Connor. 4 voices whispering through the static. 3 of them were identified as soldiers killed in the region in recent weeks. The 4th—" He paused, looking directly into my eyes. "The 4th was identified as Corporal Stevens himself." I felt the blood freeze in my veins. "That's impossible." "That's what I thought too," said O'Connor, "until I started investigating on my own. I talked to other radio operators in the region. I discovered it's not the first time this has happened." He pulled a crumpled notebook from his pocket and opened it. "In the last 2 months, 7 radio operators have disappeared in the Ardennes forests, all under similar circumstances, all leaving their radios tuned to the same frequency, and with each disappearance, a new voice joins the chorus." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because you were the only one who survived an encounter with whatever this is. And because I need to know, what did you really see that night?" I told O'Connor everything that had happened, without omitting any detail. He listened in silence, making occasional notes. When I finished, he was silent for long minutes. "Elias," he said finally, "what I'm going to tell you now cannot leave this room. The Army has officially banned any discussion of these incidents. Direct orders from higher command." "Why?" "Because they're afraid. Afraid that news will spread and cause panic among the troops. Afraid that soldiers will refuse to accept isolated radio missions. Afraid of something they can't explain or control." O'Connor got up to leave, but stopped at the door. "There's one more thing you should know. I researched the history of that Ardennes region. For centuries, local inhabitants avoided certain parts of the forest, especially during winter months. There were legends about those who whisper in the darkness, entities that fed on the vital essence of the lost and lonely." "Legends," I repeated. "Maybe," said O'Connor. "But the Germans also reported strange incidents in the region. Soldiers disappearing, radio equipment picking up voices of the dead, sightings of shadow forms among the trees. Like us, they filed these reports as cases of combat stress." He opened the door, but turned one last time. "The truth is that the war just provided these things with an abundance of prey. Isolated soldiers, radio operators in advanced positions, lonely sentries, all vulnerable, all far from help, all carrying the emotional weight of war." After O'Connor left, I lay in the hospital bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to process what I had heard. 7 radio operators disappeared. 7 voices added to the chorus of whispers. and I had been the only one to escape. But why? Why had I survived when others couldn't? The answer came to me slowly, like a terrible revelation. I hadn't escaped. I had been spared. For some reason, those creatures had decided to let me live. And the more I thought about it, the more a horrible possibility took shape in my mind. What if I wasn't really a survivor? What if I was something more? What if those creatures had left me alive for a specific reason? In the following days, I began to notice strange things. Other patients in the hospital seemed uncomfortable in my presence, though they couldn't explain why. Nurses avoided being alone with me for long, and sometimes, late at night, I could swear I heard faint whispers coming from the hospital radios. A week later, I was transferred to a military hospital in the United States. Officially, it was for post-traumatic stress treatment, but I suspected there was another reason. They wanted to get me away from the Ardennes, away from any military radio equipment. During the ship journey back to the United States, I spent a lot of time on deck, looking at the ocean and trying to understand what had happened to me. It was during one of these nightly vigils that I made a disturbing discovery. There were other soldiers on the ship who had served in the Ardennes. When I talked to them about their experiences, I noticed something strange. Several of them mentioned hearing strange voices on their radios, voices that shouldn't have been there, voices of dead soldiers. But when I asked for specific details, they became confused, as if the memories were vague and uncertain. It was as if someone had planted seeds of doubt in their minds, fragments of experiences they couldn't fully explain. And then I realized something even more disturbing. When I talked to these soldiers about the voices, they began to remember more details they had forgotten or suppressed. It was as if my presence awakened memories that were dormant. One soldier, Corporal Martinez from the 106th Infantry Division, told me he had heard his dead brother's voice through the radio during a night patrol. Another, Sergeant Williams from the 28th Division, reported picking up transmissions from an entire unit that had been annihilated weeks before. The more I talked to them, the clearer it became that I hadn't been the only one to experience something supernatural in the Ardennes, but I had been the only one to survive a direct encounter with the creatures. And now, somehow, my presence was awakening similar memories in other soldiers. That's when a terrible possibility occurred to me. What if I weren't just a witness to what had happened? What if I were part of it? What if those creatures had left me something when they touched me? Something that connected me to them, that made me a kind of living antenna for their influences. We arrived in the United States in March 1945. The war in Europe was coming to an end, but my personal war was just beginning. I was discharged from the Army with a disability pension due to post-traumatic stress and returned to Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Sarah was still waiting for me. She had kept all my letters, maintained my photo on the bedside table, prayed for me every night. We married in the summer of 1945 in a simple ceremony at the Methodist Church where we had met years before. I tried to resume my normal life. I went back to work in my father's radio shop, fixing devices for neighbors. But something had changed. I couldn't work with radios anymore without hearing things, faint whispers in empty frequencies, voices that shouldn't be there. At first I thought it was just residual trauma, but the voices became clearer over time, not weaker, and they began to include names of people I knew in town, people who were still alive. That's when I realized the terrible truth. Those creatures hadn't let me go. They had transformed me into a kind of beacon, an anchor point in the world of the living that allowed them to extend their influence beyond the Ardennes forests. I stopped working with radios. I sold the shop and became a farmer, working with my hands in the earth, away from any electronic equipment. Sarah and I had 3 children, and for a few years I managed to almost forget what had happened in the war. But the voices never stopped completely. They were always there, whispering at the edge of my consciousness, especially during winter nights when the wind blew in a certain way. In 1963, 18 years after the end of the war, I received a letter that changed everything. It was from Sergeant O'Connor, now retired and living in Boston. The letter was brief, but its content chilled my blood. "Jack, you need to know. They found something in the Ardennes forests. A team of Belgian archaeologists was excavating a medieval site when they discovered a network of underground tunnels that extend for kilometers under the forest, and at the center of this network, they found something they can't explain. It's a circular chamber, carved in solid rock, with symbols engraved on the walls that don't correspond to any known language. And in the center of the chamber, There's a structure that appears to be some kind of antenna or transmitter, made of a metal they can't identify. The most disturbing thing, the structure is still active. It emits a weak but constant signal on frequency 42.5 MHz, and when they tune to that frequency, they hear voices, dozens of voices, whispering in various languages. English, German, French and others they can't identify. The Belgian government classified the site as ultra-secret and sealed the tunnels. But before they did, I got a copy of the recordings they made. Jack, one of the voices is yours. You're whispering through that frequency, calling for other lost soldiers. I need to know, are you okay? Are you still... You? I never answered O'Connor's letter. How could I? How could I explain that I knew my voice was on that frequency? That sometimes, during the night, I could feel my consciousness being pulled away from my body, traveling through radio waves to dark and cold places. How could I explain that I was no longer completely human? In the following years, I began researching on my own. I discovered that similar incidents had been reported in other wars, in other places where isolated soldiers operated radio equipment. The Korean War, Vietnam, always the same story. Radio operators disappearing, voices of the dead being picked up on empty frequencies, sightings of shadow forms, and always, somewhere in the world, there was someone like me, someone who had survived an encounter, but who had been marked, someone who had become a bridge between worlds. In 1987, radio technology began to change. Digital equipment replaced old analog radios. I thought this might break the connection, free me from the influence of those creatures. But I was wrong. They adapted. They learned to use cell phones, computers, any device capable of transmitting signals. Technology evolved, but the voices remained. Sarah died in 1998 after a long battle with cancer. In her last days, she confessed something that broke my heart. "Jack," she said, holding my hand with her remaining strength, "sometimes, during the night, I hear voices coming from your room. Voices of men who seem to be calling for you. Who are they, Jack? What do they want?" I couldn't answer. How could I explain that they were echoes of all the soldiers who had been lost over the years, that I had become a kind of involuntary collector of lost souls? After Sarah's death, I isolated myself completely. I sold the farm and moved to a small cabin in northern Minnesota, far from any city, far from any modern technology. I thought isolation might finally give me peace, but the voices followed me. They always follow me. Now at 98 years old, I know my time is coming to an end. I can feel my body failing, my mind fragmenting, and the voices are getting louder, more insistent. They know that soon I will join them permanently. But before leaving, I needed to tell this story. I needed to warn you about what exists in the shadows, about the forces that learn to use our own technology against us, because the truth is that the war never really ended for me. It just changed form. And now, with each new conflict, with each new lost and lonely soldier operating a radio somewhere remote in the world, these creatures gain more power, more voices for their eternal chorus. A few weeks ago, I received a call on my landline. It shouldn't have been possible. The number isn't listed and very few people know where I live. But the phone rang, and when I answered, I heard a familiar voice. "Jack," said Danny Morrison, his voice as clear as if he were standing beside me. "It's time to come home." "Not yet," I replied. "I still have a story to tell." "We've waited," said Tommy Chen. "We've waited a long time, but we can't wait forever." "The squad isn't complete without you, Sergeant," added Marcus Webb, "and there's so much work to be done, so many lost soldiers who need guidance." I hung up the phone, but I know they'll be back. They always come back. Last night, while I was writing this story, I heard something that made me stop. It was the sound of a radio being tuned, though there's no radio in my cabin. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere, as if the air itself were becoming a receiver. And then I heard a new voice, a young, frightened voice speaking with a Southern American accent. "Hello, is anyone hearing me? My name is Private James Patterson, 3rd Infantry Battalion. I'm lost in Afghanistan, and my radio is only picking up this frequency. Please, can someone help me? They're still there, still hunting, still collecting voices for their eternal chorus. Technology has changed, conflicts have changed, but the creatures remain the same. And me, I'm the bridge they use to reach new worlds, new wars, new lost soldiers. This is my confession, my warning, my last attempt to alert the world about what exists in the shadows of war." If you are soldiers, if you operate communication equipment in isolated areas, remember this story. If you hear voices that shouldn't be there, if you pick up transmissions from units you know are dead, turn off the equipment immediately. Don't try to respond. Don't try to help, because some voices we hear in the darkness aren't echoes of the past. They're calls from the future. They're traps prepared by creatures that existed long before us and will continue to exist long after our civilization is just dust. And if you hear my voice whispering through static, if you hear Jack Elias calling for help through a frequency that shouldn't exist, do me a favor. Don't answer, because I'm no longer the man I was. I'm something different now, something that serves dark masters in a war that never ends. The phone is ringing again. I can hear the voices of my squad calling me. Danny, Tommy, Marcus, and so many others who have joined them over the years. Soldiers from all wars, from all countries, united in an eternal chorus of whispers. It's time to answer. It's time to go home. But remember my story. Remember the warning. And if you ever hear voices whispering through static, if you hear dead soldiers calling for help through empty frequencies, remember Jack Elias and what happened in the Ardennes forests in December 1944. Remember and run. Because some doors once opened can never be closed again, and some wars never end. They just find new soldiers to fight.